Chapter 4. The Predecessor Culture and the Enlightenment Project of Justifying Morality. What I am going to suggest is that the key episodes in the social history which transformed, fragmented, and, if my extreme view is correct, largely displaced morality, and so created the possibility of the emotivist self, which is with its characteristic form of relationship and modes of utterance, were episodes in the history of philosophy that it is only in the light of that history that we can understand how the idiosyncrasies of everyday contemporary moral discourse came to be, and thus how the emotivist self was able to find a means of expression. Yet how can this be so? In our own culture, academic philosophy is a highly marginal and specialized activity. Professors of philosophy do from time to time seek to wear the clothes of relevance, and some of the college-educated public are haunted by a vague, cartoon-like memory of Philosophy 101. But both would find it surprising, and the larger public even more surprising, if it were suggested, as I am now suggesting, that the roots of some of the problems which now engage the specialized attention of academic philosophers, and the roots of some of the problems central to our everyday social and practical lives, are one and the same. Surprise would only be succeeded by incredulity if it were further suggested that we cannot understand, let alone solve, one of these sets of problems without understanding the other. Yet this might become less implausible if the thesis were cast in historical form. For the claim is that both our general culture and our academic philosophy are in central part the offspring of a culture in which philosophy did constitute a central form of social activity, in which its role and function was very unlike that which it has with us. It was, so I shall argue, the failure of that culture to solve its problems at once practical and philosophical, which was and perhaps the key factor in determining the form both of our academic philosophical problems and of our practical social problems. What was that culture? One so close to our own that it is not always easy for us to understand the distinctiveness. Its difference from our own, and so not easy either to understand its unity and coherence. For this there are also other more accidental reasons. One such reason why the unity and the coherence of the 18th century culture of enlightenment sometimes escapes us is that we too often understand it as primarily an episode in French cultural history. In fact, France is, from the standpoint of that culture itself, the most backward of the Enlightenment nations. The French themselves often avowedly looked to English models, but England, in turn, was overshadowed by the achievements of the Scottish Enlightenment. The great figures of all were certainly German, that is, Kant and Mozart. But for intellectual variety, as well as intellectual range, not even the Germans can outmatch David Hume, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, John Miller, Lord Combs, and Lord Monboddo. What the French lacked was threefold, that is, a secularized Protestant background, an educated class which linked the servants of government, the clergy, and the lay thinkers in a single reading public, and a newly alive type of university exemplified in Königsberg in the east and in Edinburgh and Glasgow in the west. The French 18th century intellectuals constituted intelligentsia, a group at once educated and alienated, while the 18th century Scottish, English, Dutch, Danish, and Prussian intellectuals are, on the contrary, at home in the social world, even when they are highly critical of it. The 18th century French intelligentsia have to wait for the 19th century Russians before they find any counterpart elsewhere. Hence, what we are dealing with is a culture that is primarily Northern European. Spaniards, Italians, and the Gaelic and Slavonic-speaking peoples do not belong to it. Vico plays no part in its intellectual development. It has, of course, outposts outside Northern Europe, most notably in New England and Switzerland. It is influential in southern Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Kingdom of Naples, and most of the 18th century French intelligentsia have the will to belong to it in spite of the differences in their situation. Indeed, at least the first phase of the French Revolution can be understood as an attempt to enter by political means this North European culture and so to abolish the gap between French ideas and French social and political life. Certainly Kant recognized the French Revolution as a political expression of thought akin to his own. It was a musical culture, and there is perhaps a closer relationship between this fact and the central philosophical problems of the culture than has usually been recognized. For the relationship of our beliefs to sentences that we only or primarily sing, let alone to the music which accompanies those sentences, is not at all the same as the relationship of our beliefs to the sentences that we primarily say, and say in an assertive mode. When the Catholic Mass becomes a genre available for concert performance by Protestants, when we listen to the Scripture because of what Bach wrote rather than because of what St. Matthew wrote, then sacred texts are being preserved in a form in which the traditional links with belief have been broken, even in some measure for those who still count themselves believers. It is not, of course, that there is no link with belief. You cannot simply detach the music of Bach or even of Handel from the Christian religion, but a traditional distinction between the religious and the aesthetic has been blurred. And this is as true when the beliefs are new as when they are traditional. Mozart's Freemasonry, which is perhaps the religion of enlightenment par excellence, stands in an ambiguous relationship to the magic flute, as does Handel's Messiah to Protestant Christianity. This is a culture, then, in which, therefore, there has been not only the kind of change of belief represented by the secularization of Protestantism, but also, even for those who believe, a change in the modes of belief. It is not surprising that key questions arise about the justification of belief, and most of all, about the justification of moral belief. We are so accustomed to classifying judgments, arguments, and deeds in terms of morality that we forget how relatively new the notion was in the culture of the Enlightenment. Consider one very striking fact, that is, in the culture of the Enlightenment, the first language of educated discourse was no longer Latin, but it remained learning's second language. In Latin, as in ancient Greek, there is no word correctly translated by our word moral, or rather, there is no such word until our word moral is translated back into Latin. Certainly, the term moral is the etymological descendant of moralis, but moralis, like its Greek predecessor, ethikos. Cicero invented moralis to translate the Greek word in the De Fato, means pertaining to character, where a man's character is nothing other than his set dispositions to behave systematically in one way rather than another, to lead one particular kind of life. The early uses of the term moral in English translate the Latin and move to its use as a noun, where the moral of any literary passage is the practical lesson that it teaches. In these early uses, the term moral contrasts neither with such expressions as prudential or self-interested, nor with such expressions as legal or religious. The word to which it is closest in meaning is perhaps simply the term practical. Its subsequent history is one in which it is at first perhaps most usually part of the expression moral virtue, and then becomes a predicate in its own right, with a continual tendency to narrow its meaning. It is in the 16th and 17th centuries that it recognizably takes on its modern meaning and becomes available for use in the context which I have just noted. It is in the late 17th century that it is used for the first time in its most restricted sense of all, that in which it has to do primarily with sexual behavior. How could it come about that the phrase being immoral could be equated even as a special idiom with being sexually lax? The answer to this question must be delayed, for the history of the word moral cannot be told adequately apart from an account of the attempts to provide a rational justification for morality in that historical period, from, say, 1630 to 1850, when it acquired a sense at once general and specific. In that period, the term morality became the name for that particular sphere in which rules of conduct, which are neither theological nor legal nor aesthetic, are allowed a cultural space of their own. It is only in the later 17th century and the 18th century when this distinguishing of the moral from the theological, the legal, and the aesthetic has become a received doctrine that the project of an independent rational justification of morality becomes not merely the concern of individual thinkers, but central to Northern European culture. A central thesis of this book is that the breakdown of this project provided the historical background against which the predicaments of our own culture can become intelligible. To justify this thesis, it is necessary to recount in some detail the history of that project and its breakdown. And the most illuminating way to recount that history is to recount it backwards, beginning from that point at which, for the first time, the distinctively modern standpoint appears in something like fully fledged form. What I earlier picked out as the distinctively modern standpoint was, of course, that which envisages moral debate in terms of a confrontation between incompatible and incommensurable moral premises, and moral commitment as the expression of a criterionless choice between such premises, a type of choice for which no rational justification can be given. This element of arbitrariness in our moral culture was presented as a philosophical discovery, indeed as a discovery of a disconcerting, even shocking kind, long before it became a commonplace of everyday discourse. Indeed, that discovery was first presented precisely with the intention of shocking the participants in everyday moral discourse in a book which is at once the outcome and the epitaph of the Enlightenment's systematic attempt to discover a rational justification for morality. The book is Kierkegaard's Enten Eller. I think that's either or in English. And if we do not usually read it in terms of this historical perspective, that is because over-familiarity with its thesis has dulled our sense of its astonishing novelty in the time and place of its writing. The Northern European Culture of Copenhagen in 1842. Enten Eller has three central features to which we ought to attend. The first is the connection between its mode of presentation and its central thesis. It is a book in which Kierkegaard wears a number of masks and by their very number invents a new literary genre. Kierkegaard was not the first author to divide up the self, to allocate it among a series of masks, each of which acts out the masquerade of an independent self, and so to create a new literary genre in which the author is present as himself more directly and intimately than in any form of traditional genre, and yet by his partitioning of his self denies his own presence. Diderot, in Le Nouveau de Rameau, was the first master of this new, peculiarly modern genre. But we can see a partial ancestor of both Diderot and Kierkegaard in that argument between the skeptical self and the Christian self which Pascal had intended to conduct in the Pensée, an argument of which we possess only the dismembered fragments. Kierkegaard professed intention in designing the pseudonyms from Kierkegaard's professed intention in designing the pseudonymous form of Enten Eller was to present the reader with an ultimate choice, himself not able to commend one alternative rather than another, because never appearing as himself. The character A commends the aesthetic way of life. The character B commends the ethical way of life. Victor Ermitia edits and annotates the papers of both. The choice between the ethical and the aesthetic is not the choice between good and evil. It is the choice whether or not to choose in terms of good and evil. At the heart of the aesthetic way of life, as Kierkegaard characterizes it, is the attempt to lose the self in the immediacy of present experience. The paradigm of aesthetic expression is the romantic lover who is immersed in his own passion. By contrast, the paradigm of the ethical is marriage, a state of commitment and obligation through time, in which the present is bound by the past and to the future. Each of the two ways of life is informed by different concepts, incompatible attitudes, rival premises. Suppose that someone confronts the choice between them, having as yet embraced neither. He can be offered no reason for preferring one to the other. For if a given reason offers support for the ethical way of life, to live in that way will serve the demands of duty, or to live in that way will be to accept moral perfection as a goal, and so to give a certain kind of meaning to one's actions. The person who has not yet embraced either the ethical or the aesthetic still has to choose whether or not to treat this reason as having any force. If it already has force for him, he has already chosen the ethical, which, ex hypothesi, he has not. And so it is also with reasons supportive of the aesthetic. The man who has not yet chosen has still to choose whether to treat them as having force. He still has to choose his first principles, and just because they are first principles, prior to any others in the chain of reasoning, no more ultimate reasons can be adduced to support them. Kierkegaard thus presents himself as not endorsing either position, for he is neither A nor B, and if we take him to be presenting the position that there are no rational grounds for choice between either position, that the either-or choice is ultimate, he denies that too, for he is not Victor Ermitia any more than he is the character A or the character B. Yet at the same time, he is everywhere, and perhaps we detect his presence most of all in the belief that he puts into the mouth of B, that anyone who faces the choice between the aesthetic and the ethical will in fact choose the ethical, for the energy, the passion of serious choice will, so to speak, carry the person who chooses into the ethical. Here, I believe, Kierkegaard asserts, if it is Kierkegaard asserting, what is false, that is, the aesthetic can be chosen seriously, although the burden of choosing it can be as passion-ridden as that of choosing the ethical. I think especially of the young men of my father's generation who watched their own earlier ethical principles die along with the deaths of their friends in the trenches in the mass murder of Ypres and the Somme, and who returned determined that nothing was ever going to matter to them again, and invented the aesthetic triviality of the 1920s. My account of Kierkegaard's relationship to Enten Eller is, of course, crucially different from that given by Kierkegaard himself later on, when he came to interpret his own writings retrospectively in terms of a single unchanging vocation. And the best Kierkegaard scholars of our own time, such as Louis Mackay and Gregor Malashuk, have in this respect at least endorsed Kierkegaard's self-portrait. Yet if we take all the evidence that we have of Kierkegaard's attitudes in and up to the end of 1842, and perhaps the text and the pseudonyms of Enten Eller are the best evidence of all, it seems to me that their position is difficult to sustain. A little later, in Philosophicae Philosophicae Smuler in 1845, Kierkegaard invokes this crucial new idea of radical and ultimate choice to explain how one becomes a Christian, and by that time his characterization of the ethical has changed radically too. That had become already abundantly clear even in 1843 in Fricht og Behaven. But in 1842, he still stands in the most ambitious of relationships to his new idea, simultaneously being its author and disavowing its authorship. For this idea is not merely at odds with Hegel's philosophy, which already in Inteneller is one of Kierkegaard's chief targets. This idea destroys the whole tradition of a rational moral culture if it itself cannot be rationally defeated. The second feature of Inteneller, to which we must now turn, concerns the deep internal inconsistency, partially concealed by the book's form, between its concept of radical choice and its concept of the ethical. The ethical is presented as that realm in which principles have authority over us independently of our attitudes, preferences, and feelings. How I feel at any given moment is irrelevant to the question of how I must live. This is why marriage is the paradigm of the ethical. Bertrand Russell has described how one day in 1902, while riding a bicycle, he suddenly realized that he was no longer in love with his first wife, and from this realization there followed in time the breakup of that marriage. Kierkegaard would have said, and surely rightly, that any attitude whose absence can be discovered in a sudden flash while riding a bicycle is only an aesthetic reaction, and that such experience has to be irrelevant to the commitment which genuine marriage involves, to the authority of the moral precepts which define marriage. But now whence does the ethical derive this kind of authority? To answer this question, consider what kind of authority any principle has which it is open to us to choose to regard as authoritative or not. I may choose, for example, to observe a regime of asceticism and fasting, and I may do this for reasons of health, let us say, or religion. What authority such principles possess derives from the reasons for my choice. Insofar as they are good reasons, the principles have corresponding authority. Insofar as they are not, the principles are to that same extent deprived of authority. It would follow that a principle for the choice of which no reasons could be given would be a principle devoid of authority. I might indeed adopt such a principle from whim or caprice or from some arbitrary purpose. I just happen to like acting in that way. But if I then choose to abandon the principle whenever it suited me, I would be entirely free to do so. Such a principle, and it may even be stretching language to call it a principle, would seem clearly to belong to Kierkegaard's aesthetic realm. But now the doctrine of Inteneller is plainly to the effect that the principles which depict the ethical way of life are to be adopted for no reason, but for a choice that lies beyond reasons, just because it is the choice of what is to count for us as reasons. Yet the ethical is to have authority over us. But how can that which we adopt for one reason have any authority? But how can that for which we adopt for no reason have any authority over us? The contradiction in Kierkegaard's doctrine is plain. To this, someone might reply that we characteristically appeal to authority when we have no reasons. We may appeal to the authority of the custodians of the Christian revelation, for example, at the very point where reason breaks down. So that the notion of authority and the notion of reason are not, as my argument suggests, intimately connected, but are in fact mutually exclusive. Yet this concept of authority, as excluding reason, is, as I have already noticed, itself a peculiarity, even if not exclusively a modern concept fashioned in a culture to which the notion of authority is alien and repugnant, so that appeals to authority appear irrational. But the traditional authority of the ethical, in the culture which Kierkegaard inherited, was not of this arbitrary kind. And it is this traditional concept of authority which must be embodied in the ethical if it is to be as Kierkegaard describes it. It is not surprising that just as it was Kierkegaard who first discovered the concept of radical choice, so it is in Kierkegaard's writings that the links between reason and authority are broken too. I have argued then that there is a deep incoherence in Incoherence. If the ethical has some basis, it cannot be provided by the notion of radical choice. Before I turn to ask why Kierkegaard should have arrived at this incoherent position, however, let me notice a third feature of Incoherence. It is the conservative and traditional character of Kierkegaard's account of the ethical. In our own culture, the influence of the notion of radical choice appears in our dilemmas over which ethical principles to choose. We are almost intolerably conscious of rival moral alternatives. But Kierkegaard combines the notion of radical choice with an unquestioning conception of the ethical. Promise-keeping, truth-telling, and benevolence embodied in universalizable moral principles are understood in a very simple way. The ethical man has no great problems of interpretation once he has made his initial choice. To notice this is to notice that Kierkegaard is providing a new practical and philosophical underpinning for an older and inherited way of life. It is perhaps this combination of novelty and tradition which accounts for the incoherence at the heart of Kierkegaard's position. It is certainly, so I shall argue, just this deeply incoherent combination of the novel and the inherited which is the logical outcome of the Enlightenment's project to provide a rational foundation for and justification of morality. To understand why this is so, it is necessary to turn back from Kierkegaard to Kant. Because of Kierkegaard's own ceaseless polemics against Hegel, it is all too easy not to notice Kierkegaard's positive debts to Kant. But it is in fact Kant who in almost every area sets the philosophical scene for Kierkegaard. It is Kant's treatment of the proofs of the existence of God and his view of what constitutes rational religion that provide a crucial part of the background for Kierkegaard's account of Christianity, and it is equally Kant's moral philosophy which is the essential background for Kierkegaard's treatment of the ethical. It is not difficult to recognize in Kierkegaard's account of the aesthetic way of life a literary genius's vision of Kant's account of inclination. Whatever else Kant may be thought, and it is difficult to exaggerate his achievement, he was clearly not a literary genius, as any philosopher in history. Yet it is in Kant's honest and unpretentious German that Kierkegaard's elegant but not always transparent Danish finds its paternity. Central to Kant's moral philosophy are two deceptively simple theses. If the rules of morality are rational, they must be the same for all rational beings, in just the way that the rules of arithmetic are. And if the rules of morality are binding on all rational beings, then the contingent ability of such beings to carry them out must be unimportant. What is important is their will to carry them out. The project of discovering a rational justification of morality therefore simply is the project of discovering a rational test which will discriminate those maxims which are genuine expression of the moral law when they determine the will from those maxims which are not such an expression. Kant is not, of course, himself in any doubt as to which maxims are in fact the expression of the moral law. Virtuous plain men and women did not have to wait for philosophy to tell them in what a good will consisted, and Kant never doubted for a moment that the maxims which he had learnt from his own virtuous parents were those which had to be vindicated by a rational test. Thus, the content of Kant's morality was conservative in just the way that the content of Kierkegaard's was, and this is scarcely surprising. Although Kant's Lutheran childhood in Königsberg was 100 years before Kierkegaard's Lutheran childhood in Copenhagen, the same inherited morality marked both men. Kant then possesses, on the one hand, a stock of maxims, and on the other, a conception of what a rational test for a maxim must be. What is this conception, and whence is it derived? We can best approach an answer to these questions by considering why Kant rejects two conceptions of such a test which had been widely influential in the European traditions. On the one hand, Kant rejects the view that the test of a proposed maxim is whether obedience to it would in the end lead to the happiness of a rational being. Kant has no doubt that all men do indeed desire happiness, and he has no doubt that the highest good conceivable is that of the individual's moral perfection crowned by the happiness which it merits. But he nevertheless believes that our conception of happiness is too vague and shifting to provide a reliable moral guide. Moreover, any precept designed to secure our happiness would be an expression of a rule holding only conditionally. It would instruct to do such and such, if and insofar as doing such and such would in fact lead to happiness as a result. Whereas Kant takes it to be the case that all genuine expressions of the moral law have an unconditional categorical character. They do not enjoin us hypothetically, they simply enjoin us. Morality, then, can find no basis in our desires, but it can find no basis either in our religious beliefs. For the second traditional view, which Kant repudiates, is that according to which the test of a given maxim or precept is whether it is commanded by God. On Kant's view, it can never follow from the fact that God commands us to do such and such, that we ought to do such and such. In order for us to reach such a conclusion justifiably, we would also have to know that we always ought to do what God commands. But this last we could not know unless we ourselves possessed a standard of moral judgment independent of God's commandments, by means of which we could judge God's deeds and words, and so find the latter morality worthy of obedience. But clearly, if we possess such a standard, the commandments of God will be redundant. We can already notice certain large and obvious features of Kant's thought which declare it to be the immediate ancestor of Kierkegaard's. The sphere in which happiness is to be pursued is sharply distinguished from the sphere of morality, and both in turn as sharply from that of divine morality and commandment. Moreover, the precepts of morality are not only the same precepts as those which were later to constitute the ethical for Kierkegaard, but they are to inspire the same kind of respect. Yet, where Kierkegaard had seen the basis of the ethical in choice, Kant sees it in reason. Practical reason, according to Kant, employs no criterion external to itself. It appeals to no content derived from experience. Hence, Kant's independent arguments against the use of happiness or the invocation of God's revealed will merely reinforce a position already entailed by the Kantian view of reason's function and powers. It is of the essence of reason that it lays down principles which are universal, categorical, and internally consistent. Hence, a rational morality will lay down principles which both can and ought to be held by all men, independent of circumstances and conditions, and which could consistently be obeyed by every rational agent on every occasion. The test for a proposed maxim is then easily framed as follows. Can we or can we not consistently will that everyone should always act on it? How are we to decide whether this attempt to formulate a decisive test for the maxims of morality is successful or not? Kant tries to show that such maxims as always tell the truth, always keep promises, be benevolent to those in need, and do not commit suicide pass his test, while such maxims as only keep promises when it is convenient to you fail. In fact, however, even to approach a semblance of showing this, he has to use notoriously bad arguments, the climax of which is his assertion that any man who wills the maxim, to kill myself when the prospects of pain outweigh those of happiness, is inconsistent because such willing contradicts an impulse to life implanted in all of us. This is as if someone were to assert that any man who wills the maxim, always to keep my hair cut short, is inconsistent because such willing contradicts an impulse to the growth of hair implanted in all of us. But it is not just that Kant's own arguments involve large mistakes. It is very easy to see that many immoral and trivial non-moral maxims are vindicated by Kant's test quite as convincingly, in some cases more convincingly, than the moral maxims which Kant aspires to uphold. So, keep all your promises throughout your entire life except one. Persecute all those who hold false religious beliefs, and always eat mussels on Monday in March will all pass Kant's test, for all can be consistently universalized. To this one rejoinder may be that if this follows from what Kant said, it cannot be what Kant meant. Certainly and obviously it was not what Kant envisioned, for he himself believed that his test of consistent universalizability had a defining moral content which would have excluded such universal and trivial maxims. Kant believed this because he believed that his formulations of the categorical imperative in terms of universalizability were equivalent to a quite different formulation. Always act so as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of others, as an end, and not as a means. This formulation clearly does have a moral content, although one that is not very precise, if it is not supplemented by a good deal of further elucidation. What Kant means by treating someone as an end rather than as a means seems to be as follows. As I noticed earlier in using Kant's moral philosophy to highlight a contrast with emotivism, I may propose a course of action to someone either by offering him reasons for so acting or by trying to influence him in non-rational ways. If I do the former, I treat him as a rational will, worthy of the same respect as is due to myself, for in offering him reasons, I offer him an impersonal consideration for him to evaluate. What makes a reason a good reason has nothing to do with who utters it on a given occasion, and until an agent has decided for himself whether a reason is a good reason or not, he has no reason to act. By contrast, an attempt at non-rational persuasion embodies an attempt to make the agent a mere instrument of my will, without any regard for his rationality. Thus, what Kant enjoins is what a long line of moral philosophers have followed. The Plato of Gorgias in enjoining. But Kant gives us no good reason for holding this position. I can without any inconsistency whatsoever flout it in the following manner. Let everyone except me be treated as a means, may be immoral, but it is not inconsistent, and there is not even any inconsistency in willing a universe of egoists, all of whom live by this maxim. It might be inconvenient for each if everyone lived by this maxim, but it would not be impossible, and to invoke considerations of convenience would in any case be to introduce just that prudential reference to happiness which Kant aspires to eliminate from all considerations of morality. To attempt to found what Kant takes to be the maxims of morality on what Kant takes to be reason therefore fails just as surely as Kierkegaard's attempt to discover a foundation for them in an act of choice failed. And the two failures are closely related. Kierkegaard and Kant agree in their conception of morality, but Kierkegaard inherits that conception together with an understanding that the project of giving a rational vindication of morality has failed. Kant's failure provided Kierkegaard with his starting point. That is, the act of choice had to be called in to do the work that reason could not do. And yet, if we understand Kierkegaardian choice as a surrogate for Kantian reason, we must also in turn understand that Kant, too, was responding to an earlier philosophical episode, that Kant's appeal to reason was the historical heir and successor of Diderot and Hume's appeals to desire and to the passions. Kant's project was an historical response to their failure, just as Kierkegaard's was to his. Wherein did that earlier failure lie? We need to note, first of all, that Diderot and Hume very largely share the view taken by Kierkegaard and Kant of the content of morality. And this is all the more surprising because, unlike Kierkegaard and Kant, they like to think of themselves as philosophical radicals. Yet, whatever their radical gestures, both Hume and Diderot were by and large and for the most part moral conservatives. Hume is prepared to repeal the traditional Christian prohibition of suicide, but his views of both promising and property are as uncompromising as Kant's. Diderot professes to believe that basic human nature is both revealed in and served by what he portrays as the promiscuous sexuality of the Polynesians, but he is very clear that Paris is not Polynesia, and in Les Nouveaux de Rameau, the moi, the philosophe, with whom the older Diderot so clearly identifies himself, is a conventional bourgeois moralist with as staid a view of marriage, of promises, of truth-telling and conscientiousness as any adherent of Kantian duty or the Kierkegaardian ethical. And this was not merely Diderot's theory. In the upbringing of his own daughter, his practice was precisely that of the bon bourgeois of his dialogue. In the persona of the philosophe, the view which he propounds is that if in modern France we all pursue our desires with an enlightened eye to the long run, we shall see that the conservative moral rules are by and large the rules which the appeal to their basis in desire and passion will vindicate. To this, the younger Rameau has three replies. First, why should we have any regard for the long run, if the prospect of immediacy is sufficiently enticing? Secondly, does the philosophe's view not entail that even in the long run we ought to obey the moral rules only when and insofar as they serve our desires? And thirdly, is not this indeed the way of the world, that each individual, each class consults his or its desires, and to satisfy them preys on each other? Where the philosophe sees principle, the family, a well-ordered natural and social world, Rameau sees these as sophisticated disguises for self-love, seduction, and predatory enterprise. The challenge that Rameau presents to the philosophe cannot, of course, be met within the terms of Diderot's own thought. For what divides them is the question of precisely which of our desires are to be acknowledged as legitimate guides to action, and which, on the other hand, are to be inhibited, frustrated, or re-educated. And clearly this question cannot be answered by trying to use our desires themselves as some sort of criterion. Just because all of us have, actually or potentially, numerous desires, many of them conflicting and mutually incompatible, we have to decide between the rival claims of rival desires. We have to decide in what direction to educate our desires, how to order a variety of impulses, felt needs, emotions, and purposes. Hence, those rules which enable us to decide between the claims of, and so to order our desires, including the rules of morality, cannot themselves be derived from or justified by reference to the desires among which they have to arbitrate. Diderot himself elsewhere, in the supplement to Bougainville's Voyage, tried to distinguish between those desires which are natural to man, the desires obeyed by the imaginary Polynesians of his narrative, and those artificially formed and corrupted desires which civilization breeds in us. But in the very act of making this distinction, he undermines his own attempt to find a basis for morality in human physiological nature. for he himself is forced to find grounds for discriminating between desires. In the supplement, he is able to avoid facing the implications of his own thesis, but in Les Nouveaux de Romu, he forces himself to recognize that there are rival and incompatible desires and rival and incompatible orderings of desire. Yet Diderot's failure is not, of course, merely his own. The same difficulties that prevent Diderot from vindicating morality cannot be evaded by a philosophically more sophisticated account such as that given by Hume. And Hume makes as strong a case for his position as could conceivably be made. Like Diderot, he understands particular moral judgments as expressions of feeling, of the passions, for it is the passions and not reason which moves us to action. But he also, like Diderot, recognizes that in judging morally we invoke general rules, and he aspires to explain these by showing their utility in helping us to attain those ends which the passions set before us. Underlying this view is an implicit, unacknowledged view of the state of the passions in a normal and what we might call, but for Hume's view of reason, reasonable man. Both in his history and in the inquiry, the passions of so-called enthusiasts, and more particularly of the 17th century levelers on the one hand, and of Catholic asceticism on the other, are treated as deviant, absurd, and, in the case of the levelers, criminal. The normal passions are those of a complacent heir of the Revolution of 1688. Hence, Hume is already covertly using some normative standard, in fact, a highly conservative normative standard, to discriminate among desires and feelings, and by so doing, lays himself open to just the charge which Diderot, in the person of the younger Romu, brought against himself in the person of the philosophe. But this is not all. In the treatise, Hume posed the question why, if such rules as those of justice and of promise-keeping were to be kept because, and only because they served our long-term interests, we should not be justified in breaking them whenever they did not serve our interests, and the breach would have no further ill consequences. In the course of formulating this question, he denies explicitly that any innate spring of altruism or sympathy for others could supply the defects of an argument from interest and utility. But in the inquiry, he feels compelled to invoke just such a spring. Whence this change? It is clear that Hume's invocation of sympathy is an invention intended to bridge the gap between any set of reasons which could support unconditional adherence to general and unconditional rules, and any set of reasons for action or judgment which could derive from our particular, fluctuating, circumstance-governed desires, emotions, and interests. Later on, Adam Smith wants to invoke sympathy for precisely the same purpose. But the gap, of course, is logically unbridgeable, and the term sympathy, as used by Hume and Smith, is the name of a philosophical fiction. What I have not given due weight to so far is the power of Hume's negative arguments. What drives Hume to the conclusion that morality must be understood in terms of, explained and justified by reference to, the place of the passions and desires in human life is his initial assumption that either morality is the work of reason or it is the work of the passions, and his own apparently conclusive arguments that it cannot be the work of reason. Hence, he is compelled to the conclusion that morality is a work of the passions quite independently of and prior to his adducing of any positive arguments for that position. The influence of negative arguments is equally clear in both Kant and Kierkegaard. Just as Hume seeks to found morality on the passions because his arguments have excluded the possibility of founding it on reason, so Kant founds it on reason because his arguments have excluded the possibility of founding it on the passions, and Kierkegaard on criterionless fundamental choice because of what he takes to be the compelling nature of the considerations which exclude both reason and the passions. Thus, the vindication of each position was made to rest in crucial part upon the failure of the other two, and the sum total of the effective criticism of each position by the others turned out to be the failure of all. The project of providing a rational vindication of morality had decisively failed, and from henceforward the morality of our predecessor culture, and subsequently of our own, lacked any public shared rationale or justification. In a world of secular rationality, religion could no longer provide such a shared background and foundation for moral discourse and action, and the failure of philosophy to provide what religion could no longer furnish was an important cause of philosophy losing its central cultural role and becoming a marginal, narrowly academic subject. Why was the significance of that failure not appreciated in the period in which it occurred? This is a question which needs to be pursued much more fully at a later stage in the argument. For the moment, I need only remark that the general literate public was the victim of a cultural history which blinded it to its own true nature, and that more philosophers began to pursue their debates in much greater isolation from that public than previously. Indeed, to the present-day Kierkegaard, Kant and Hume do not lack ingenious academic disciples in the debate between whom the continuing power only of the negative argument of each tradition against the other is the most significant feature. But before we can understand either the significance of the failure to provide a shared public rational justification for morality, or the explanation of why that significance was not appreciated either at the time or since, we shall have to arrive at a much less superficial understanding of why the project failed and what the character of that failure was. Chapter 5. Why the Enlightenment project of justifying morality had to fail. So far, I have presented the failure of the project of justifying morality merely as the failure of a succession of particular arguments. And if that were all there was to the matter, it might appear that the trouble was merely that Kierkegaard, Kant, Diderot, Hume, Smith, and their other contemporaries were not adroit enough in constructing arguments, so that an appropriate strategy would be to wait until some more powerful mind applied itself to the problems. And just this has been the strategy of the academic philosophical world, even though many professional philosophers might be a little embarrassed to admit it. But suppose, in fact, what is eminently plausible, that the failure of the 18th and 19th century project was of quite another kind. Suppose that the arguments of Kierkegaard, Kant, Diderot, Hume, Smith, and the like fail because of certain shared characteristics deriving from their highly specific shared historical background. Suppose that we cannot understand them as contributors to a timeless debate about morality, but only as the inheritors of a very specific and particular scheme of moral beliefs, a scheme whose internal incoherence ensured that the failure of the common philosophical project a scheme whose internal incoherence ensured the failure of the common philosophical project from the outset. Consider certain beliefs shared by all the contributors to the project. All of them, as I noted earlier, agreed to a surprising degree on the content and character of the precepts which constitute genuine morality. Marriage and the family are au fond, as questioned by Diderot's rationalist philosophe as they are by Kierkegaard's Judge Wilhelm. Promise-keeping and justice are as inviolable for Hume as they are for Kant. Whence did they inherit these shared beliefs? Obviously, from their shared Christian past, compared with which the divergences between Kant's and Kierkegaard's Lutheran, Hume's Presbyterian, and Diderot's Johnsonist-influenced Catholic background are relatively unimportant. At the same time, as they agree largely on the character of morality, they agree also upon what a rational justification of morality would have to be. Its key premises would characterize some feature or features of human nature, and the rules of morality would then be explained unjustified as being those rules which a being possessing just such a human nature could be expected to accept. For Diderot and Hume, the relevant features of human nature are the characteristics of the passions. For Kant, the relevant feature of human nature is the universal and categorical character of certain rules of reason. Kant, of course, denies that morality is based on human nature, but what he means by the phrase human nature is merely the physiological non-rational side of man. Kierkegaard no longer attempts to justify morality at all, but his account has precisely the same structure as that which is shared by the accounts of Kant, Hume, and Diderot, except that where they appeal to characteristics of the passions or of reason, he invokes what he takes to be characteristics of fundamental decision-making. Thus, all these writers share in the project of constructing valid arguments which will move from premises concerning human nature as they understand it to be conclusions about the authority of moral rules and precepts. I want to argue that any project of this form was bound to fail because of an ineradicable discrepancy between their shared conception of moral rules and precepts on the one hand, and what was shared, despite much larger convergences, in their conception of human nature on the other. Both conceptions have a history, and the relationship can only be made intelligible in the light of that history. Consider first the general form of the moral scheme which was the historical ancestor of both conceptions, the moral scheme which, in a variety of diverse forms and with numerous rivals, came for long periods to dominate the European Middle Ages from the 12th century onwards, a scheme which included both classical and theistic elements. Its basic structure is what Aristotle analyzed in the Nicomachean Ethics. Within that teleological scheme, there is a fundamental contrast between man as he happens to be and man as he could be if he realized his essential nature. Ethics is the science which is to enable men to understand how they make the transition from the former state to the latter. Ethics, therefore, in this view, presupposes some account of potentiality and act, some account of the essence of man as a rational animal, and above all, some account of the human telos. The precepts which enjoin the various virtues and prohibit the vices, which are their counterparts, instruct us how to move from potentiality to act, how to realize our true nature, and to reach our true end. To defy them will be to be frustrated and incomplete, to fail to achieve that good of rational happiness which it is peculiarly ours as a species to pursue. The desires and emotions which we possess are to be put in order and educated by the use of such precepts and by the cultivation of those habits of action which the study of ethics prescribes. Reason instructs us both as to what our true end is and how to reach it. We thus have a threefold scheme in which human nature as it happens to be, human nature in its untutored state, is initially discrepant and discordant with the precepts of ethics and needs to be transformed by the instruction of practical reason and experience into human nature as it could be if it realized its telos. Each of these three elements of the scheme, the conception of untutored nature, The conception of the precepts of rational ethics and the conception of human nature as it could be if it realized its telos requires reference to the other two if its status and function are to be intelligible. This scheme is complicated and added to, but not essentially altered, when it is placed within a framework of theistic beliefs, whether Christian, as with Aquinas, or Jewish, with Maimonides, or Islamic, with Ibn Rushd. The precepts of ethics now have to be understood not only as teleological injunctions, but also as expressions of a divinely ordered law. The table of virtues and vices has to be amended and added to, and a concept of sin is added to the Aristotelian concept of error. The law of God requires a new kind of respect and awe. The true end of man can no longer be completely achieved in this world, but only in another. Yet the threefold structure of untutored human nature as it happens to be, human nature as it could be if it realized its telos, and the precepts of rational ethics as the means for the transition from one to the other remains central to the theistic understanding of evaluative thought and judgment. Thus, moral utterance has, throughout the period in which the theistic version of classical morality predominates, both a twofold point and purpose, and a double standard. To say what someone ought to do is at one and the same time to say what course of action will, in these circumstances, as a matter of fact, lead towards a man's true end, and to say what the law, ordained by God and comprehended by reason, enjoins. Moral sentences are thus used within this framework to make claims which are true or false. Most medieval proponents of this scheme did, of course, believe that it was itself part of God's revelation, but also a discovery of reason and rationally defensible. This large area of agreement does not, however, survive when Protestantism and Jansenist Catholicism and their immediate late medieval predecessors appear on the scene, for they embody a new conception of reason. My argument is, at this and other points, both deeply indebted to and rather different from that of Anscombe in 1958. Reason can supply, so these new theologies assert, no genuine comprehension of man's true end. That power of reason was destroyed by the fall of man. See Adam integer stetesit on Calvin's view. Reason might have played the part that Aristotle assigned to it, but now reason is powerless to correct our passions. It is not unimportant that Hume's views are those of one who was brought up as a Calvinist. Nonetheless, the contrast between man as he happens to be and man as he could be if he realized his telos remains, and the divine moral law is still a schoolmaster to remove us from the former state to the latter, if only grace enables us to respond to and obey its precepts. The Jansenist Pascal stands at a peculiarly important point in the development of this history, for it is Pascal who recognizes that the Protestant cum Jansenist conception of reason is in important respects at one with the conception of reason at home in the most innovative 17th century philosophy and science. Reason does not comprehend essences or transitions from potentiality to act. These concepts belong to the despised conceptual scheme of scholasticism. Hence, anti-Aristotelian science sets strict boundaries to the powers of reason. Reason is calculative. It can assess truths of fact and mathematical relations, but nothing more. In the realm of practice, therefore, it can speak only of means. About ends, it must be silent. Reason cannot even, as Descartes believed, refute skepticism, and hence a central achievement of reason, according to Pascal, is to recognize that our beliefs are ultimately founded on nature, custom, and habit. Pascal's striking anticipations of Hume, and since we know that Hume was familiar with Pascal's writing, it is perhaps plausible to believe that here there is a direct influence, point to the way in which this concept of reason retained its power. Even Kant retains its negative characteristics. Reason for him, as much as for Hume, discerns no essential natures and no teleological features in the objective universe available for study by physics. Thus, their disagreements on human nature coexist with striking and important agreement, and what is true of them is also true of Diderot, of Smith, and of Kierkegaard. All reject any teleological view of human nature, any view of man as having an essence which defines his true end. But to understand this is to understand why their project of finding a basis for morality had to fail. The moral scheme which forms the historical background to their thought had, as we have seen, a structure which required three elements: untutored human nature, man as he could be if he realized his telos, and the moral precepts which enable him to pass from one state to the other. But the joint effect of the secular rejection of both Protestant and Catholic theology and the scientific and philosophical rejection of Aristotelianism was to eliminate any notion of man as he could be if he realized his telos. Since the whole point of ethics, both as a theoretical and a practical discipline, is to enable man to pass from his present state to his true end, the elimination of any notion of essential human nature, and with it the abandonment of any notion of a telos, leaves behind a moral scheme composed of two remaining elements whose relationship becomes quite unclear. There is, on the one hand, a certain content for morality, that is, a set of injunctions deprived of their teleological context. There is, on the other hand, a certain view of untutored human nature as it is. Since the moral injunctions were originally at home in a scheme in which their purpose was to correct, improve, and educate human nature, they are clearly not going to be such as could be deduced from true statements about human nature, or justifications in some other way by appealing to its characteristics. Or justified in some other way by appealing to its characteristics. The injunctions of morality, thus understood, are likely to be ones that human nature, thus understood, has strong tendencies to disobey. Hence, the 18th century moral philosophers engaged in what was an inevitably unsuccessful project, for they did indeed attempt to find a rational basis for their moral beliefs in a particular understanding of human nature, while inheriting a set of moral injunctions on the other hand, and a conception of human nature on the other. While inheriting a set of moral injunctions on the one hand, and a conception of human nature on the other, which had been expressly designed to be discrepant with each other. This discrepancy was not removed by their revised beliefs about human nature. They inherited incoherent fragments of a once coherent scheme of thought and action, and, since they did not recognize their own peculiar historical and cultural situation, they could not recognize the impossible and quixotic character of their self-appointed task. Yet, perhaps the phrase "could not recognize" is too strong, for we can rank order 18th century moral philosophers in respect of how far they approached to such recognition. If we do so, we discover the Scotsmen Hume and Smith are the least self-questioning, presumably because they are already comfortable and complacent within the epistemological scheme of British empiricism. Hume, indeed, had had something very like a nervous breakdown before he could come to terms with that scheme, but no hint of that breakdown remains in his writings on morality. No trace of discomfort appears either in those writings which Diderot published in his own lifetime. Yet in Les Nouveaux de Ramure, one of the manuscripts which at his death fell into the hands of Catherine the Great, and which had to be smuggled out of Russia to be published in 1803, we find a critique of the whole project of 18th century moral philosophy more trenchant and insightful than that of any external critic of the Enlightenment. If Diderot is far closer to recognition of the breakdown of the project than Hume, Kant is closer than either. He does indeed look for a foundation of morality in the universalizable prescriptions of that reason which manifests itself both in arithmetic and in morality, and in spite of his strictures against founding morality on human nature, his analysis of the nature of human reason is the basis for his own rational account of morality. Yet in the second book of the second critique, he does acknowledge that without a teleological framework, the whole project of morality becomes unintelligible. This teleological framework is presented as a so-called presupposition of pure practical reason. Its appearance in Kant's moral philosophy seemed to his 19th century readers, such as Heine and the later Neo-Kantians, an arbitrary and unjustifiable concession to positions which he had already rejected. Yet if my thesis is correct, Kant was right. Morality did, in the 18th century, as a matter of historical fact, presuppose something very like the teleological scheme of God, freedom, and happiness as the final crown of virtue which Kant propounds. Detach morality from that framework, and you will no longer have morality, or, at the very least, you will have radically transformed its character. This change of character, resulting from the disappearance of any connection between the precepts of morality and the facts of human nature, already appears in the writings of the 18th century moral philosophers themselves. For, although each of the writers we have been concerned with attempted in his positive arguments to base morality on human nature, each in his negative arguments moved toward a more and more unrestricted version of the claim that no valid argument can move from entirely factual premises to any moral or evaluative conclusion, to a principle, that is, which, once it is accepted, constitutes an epitaph to their entire project. Hume still expresses this claim in the form of a doubt rather than of a positive assertion. He remarks that in every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, authors make a transition from statements about God or human nature to moral judgments. Instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I met with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. Treatise 3:1:1. And he then goes on to demand that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. The same general principle, no longer expressed as a question, but as an assertion, appears in Kant's insistence that the injunctions of the moral law cannot be derived from any set of statements about human happiness or about the will of God, and then yet again in Kierkegaard's account of the ethical. What is the significance of this general claim? Some later moral philosophers have gone so far as to describe the thesis that from a set of factual premises no moral conclusion validly follows as a so-called truth of logic, understanding it as derivable from a more general principle which some medieval logicians formulated as the claim that in a valid argument nothing can appear in the conclusion which was not already in the premises. And such philosophers have suggested, in an argument in which any attempt is made to derive a moral or evaluative conclusion from factual premises, something which is not in the premises, namely the moral or evaluative element, will appear in the conclusion. Hence, any such argument must fail. Yet, in fact, the alleged unrestricted general logical principle on which everything is being made to depend is bogus, and the scholastic tag applies only to Aristotelian syllogisms. There are several types of valid argument in which some elements may appear in a conclusion which is not present in the premises. A. N. Pryor's counterexample to this alleged principle illustrates its breakdown adequately. From the premise, he is a sea captain, the conclusion may be validly inferred that he ought to do whatever a sea captain ought to do. This counterexample not only shows that there is no general principle of the type alleged, but it itself shows what is at least a grammatical truth. An is premise can, on occasion, entail an ought conclusion. Adherents of the no ought from is view could, however, easily meet part of the difficulty raised by Pryor's example by reformulating their own position. What they intended to claim, they might and would presumably say, is that no conclusion with substantial evaluative and moral content, and the conclusion in Pryor's example certainly does lack any such content, can be derived from factual premises. Yet the problem would remain for them as to why now anyone would accept their claim, for they have conceded that it cannot be derived from any unrestrictedly general logical principle. Yet their claim may still have substance, but a substance that derives from a particular, and in the 18th century new, conception of moral rules and judgments. It may, that is, assert a principle whose validity derives not from some general logical principle, but from the meaning of the key terms employed. Suppose that during the 17th and 18th centuries, the meaning and implication of the key terms used in moral utterance had changed their character. It could then turn out to be the case that what had once been a valid inference from or to some particular moral premise or conclusion would no longer be valid inferences from or to what seemed to be the same factual premise or moral conclusion. For what in some sense were the same expressions, the same sentences would now bear a different meaning. But do we in fact have any evidence for such a change of meaning? To answer this question, it is helpful to consider another type of counterexample to the no ought conclusions from is premises thesis. From such factual premises as this watch is grossly inaccurate and irregular in timekeeping and this watch is too heavy to carry about comfortably, the evaluative conclusion validly follows that this is a bad watch. From such factual premises as he gets a better yield for this crop per acre than any farmer in the district, he has the most effective program of soil renewal yet known, and his dairy herd wins all the first prizes at the agricultural shows, the evaluative conclusion validly follows that he is a good farmer. Both of these arguments are valid because of the special character of the concepts of a watch and of a farmer. Such concepts are functional concepts, that is to say, we define both watch and farmer in terms of the purpose or function which a watch or a farmer are characteristically expected to serve. It follows that the concept of a watch cannot be defined independently of the concept of a good watch, nor the concept of a farmer independently of that of a good farmer, and that the criterion of something's being a watch and the criterion of something's being a good watch, and so also for farmer and for all other functional concepts, are not independent of each other. Now clearly, both sets of criteria, as is evidenced by the examples given in the last paragraph, are factual. Hence, any argument which moves from premises which assert that the appropriate criteria are satisfied to a conclusion which asserts that this is a good such and such, where such and such picks out an item specified by a functional concept, will be a valid argument which moves from factual premises to an evaluative conclusion. Thus, we may safely assert that, If some amended version of the no-ought conclusion from is premises principle is to hold good, it must exclude arguments involving functional concepts from its scope. But this suggests strongly that those who have insisted that all moral arguments fall within the scope of such a principle may have been doing so because they took it for granted that no moral arguments involve functional concepts. Yet moral arguments within the classical Aristotelian tradition, whether in its Greek or its medieval versions, involve at least one central functional concept: the concept of man, understood as having an essential nature and an essential purpose or function, or telos. And it is when, and only when, the classical tradition in its integrity has been substantially rejected that moral arguments change their character so that they fall within the scope of some version of the no-ought conclusion from is premises principle. That is to say, man stands to good man as watch stands to good watch, or farmer to good farmer within the classical tradition. Aristotle takes it as a starting point for ethical inquiry that the relationship of man to living well is analogous to that of harpist to playing the harp well. See Nicomachean Ethics 1095a, line 16. But the use of man as a functional concept is far older than Aristotle, and it does not initially derive from Aristotle's metaphysical biology. It is rooted in the forms of social life to which the theorists of the classical tradition give expression. For according to that, a man is to fill a set of roles, each of which has its own point and purpose. Member of a family, citizen, soldier, philosopher, servant of God. It is only when man is thought of as an individual prior to and apart from all roles that the term man ceases to be a functional concept. For this to be so, other key moral terms must also have been partially at least changed in their meaning. The entailment relations between certain types of sentence must have changed. Thus, it is not just that moral conclusions cannot be justified in the way that they once were, but the loss of the possibility of such justification signals a correlative change in the meaning of moral idioms. So the no-ought conclusion from is premises principle becomes an inescapable truth for philosophers whose culture possesses only the impoverished moral vocabulary which results from the episodes I have recounted. That it was taken to be a timeless logical truth was a sign of a deep lack of historical consciousness, which then informed and even now infects too much of moral philosophy. For its initial proclamation was itself a crucial historical event. It signals both a final break with the classical tradition and the decisive breakdown of the 18th century project of justifying morality in the context of the inherited, but already incoherent fragments left behind from tradition. But it is not only that moral concepts and arguments at this point in history radically change their character so they become recognizably the immediate ancestors of the unsettlable, interminable arguments of our own culture. It is also the case that moral judgments change their import and meaning. Within the Aristotelian tradition, to call X good, where X may be, among other things, a person or an animal or a policy or a state of affairs, is to say that it is the kind of X which someone would choose who wanted an X for the purpose for which X's are characteristically wanted. To call a watch good is to say that it is the kind of watch which someone would choose who wanted a watch to keep time accurately, rather than, say, to throw at the cat. The presupposition of this use of the term good is that every type of item which it is appropriate to call good or bad, including persons and actions, has, as a matter of fact, some given specific purpose or function. To call something good, therefore, is also to make a factual statement. To call a particular action just or right is to say that it is what a good man would do in such a situation. Hence, this type of statement, too, is factual. Within this tradition, moral and evaluative statements can be called true or false in precisely the way in which all other factual statements can be so called. But once the notion of essential human purposes or functions disappears from morality, it begins to appear implausible to treat moral judgments as factual statements. Moreover, the secularization of morality by the Enlightenment had put in question the status of moral judgments as ostensible reports of divine law. Even Kant, who still understands moral judgments as expressions of a universal law, even if it be a law which each rational agent utters to himself, does not treat moral judgments as reports of what the law requires or commands, but as themselves imperatives, and imperatives are not susceptible of truth or falsity. Up to the present, in everyday discourse, the habit of speaking of moral judgments as true or false persists, but the question of what it is in virtue of which a particular moral judgment is true or false has come to lack any clear answer. That this should be so is perfectly intelligible if the historical hypothesis, which I have sketched, is true. That is, that moral judgments are linguistic survivals from the practices of classical theism, which have lost the context provided by these practices. In that context, moral judgments were at once hypothetical and categorical in form. They were hypothetical insofar as they expressed a judgment as to what conduct would be teleological appropriate for a human being. You ought to do so-and-so if and since your telos is such and such. Or perhaps, you ought to do so-and-so if you do not want your essential desires to be frustrated. They were categorical insofar as they reported the contents of the universal law commanded by God. You ought to do so-and-so. That is what God's law enjoins. But take away from them that in virtue of which they were hypothetical, and that in virtue of which they were categorical, and what are they? Moral judgments lose any clear status, and the sentences which express them in a parallel way lose any undebatable meaning. Such sentences become available as forms of expression for an emotivist self, which, lacking the guidance of the context in which they were originally at home, has lost its linguistic as well as its practical way in the world. Yet to put matters in this way is to anticipate in an unjustified way. For I am apparently taking for granted that these changes are indeed to be characterized in terms of such concepts as those of survival, loss of context, and consequent loss of clarity, whereas, I noted earlier, many of those who lived through this change in our predecessor culture saw it as a deliverance, both from the burdens of traditional theism and the confusions of teleological modes of thought. What I have described in terms of a loss of traditional structure and content was seen by the most articulate of their philosophical spokesmen as the achievement by the self of its proper autonomy. The self had been liberated from all those outmoded forms of social organization which had imprisoned it simultaneously within a belief in a theistic and teleological world order, and within those hierarchical structures which attempted to legitimate themselves as part of such a world order. Yet, whenever we view this decisive moment of change, whether we view this decisive moment of change as loss or liberation, as a transition to autonomy or anomy, two features of it need to be emphasized. The first is the social and political consequences of the change. Abstract changes in moral concepts are always embodied in real particular events. There is a history yet to be written in which the Medici princes, Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, Frederick the Great and Napoleon, Walpole and Wilberforce, Jefferson and Robespierre are understood as expressing in their actions, often partially and in a variety of different ways, the very same conceptual changes which at the level of philosophical theory are articulated by Machiavelli and Hobbes, by Diderot and Concordace, by Hume and Adam Smith and Kant. There ought not to be two histories, one of political and moral action and one of political and moral theorizing, because there were not two pasts, one populated only by actions, the other only by theories. Every action is the bearer and expression of more or less theory-laden beliefs and concepts. Every piece of theorizing and every expression of belief is a political and moral action. Thus, the transition into modernity was a transition both in theory and in practice, and a single transition at that. It is because the habits of mind engendered by our modern academic curriculum separate out the history of political and social change, studied under one set of rubrics in history departments by one set of scholars, from history of philosophy, studied under quite a different set of rubrics in philosophy departments by quite another set of scholars, that ideas are endowed with a falsely independent life of their own on the one hand, and political and social action is presented as peculiarly mindless in the other. This academic dualism is of course itself the expression of an idea at home almost everywhere in the modern world. So much indeed that Marxism, the most influential adversary theory of modern culture, presents what is just one more version of this same dualism in the distinction between basis and ideological superstructure. Yet we also need to remember that if the self decisively separates itself from inherited modes both of thought and practice in the course of a single and unified history, it does so in a variety of ways and with a complexity that it would be crippling to ignore. When the distinctively modern self was invented, its invention required not only a largely new social setting, but one defined by a variety of not always coherent beliefs and concepts. What was then invented was the individual, and to the question of what that invention amounted to and its part in creating our own emotivist culture, we must now turn.